The rain had been falling steadily over Paris since the early morning, weaving a silver mist across the elegant rooftops and cobbled streets. By late afternoon, the world outside Isabel Bennet's window was little more than a blur of lights and shadows. She sat curled in the window seat of her childhood bedroom, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, forehead resting against the chilled glass. Her breath formed small fog patches against it, vanishing just as quickly as they appeared. The letter in her lap trembled, not because of the draft seeping under the windowsill, but because of the fury and despair raging inside her. Marriage. Contract. Her life, sold neatly across the inked pages. Isabel had spent her entire adult life clawing her way toward independence. Every extra hour spent at work, every refusal to fall into the comfortable traps that Clarissa, her stepmother, had so artfully laid for her. And yet all of it had been undone in one evening, with one signature she had not even given. Downstairs, the Bennet estate still buzzed with the remnants of the confrontation. The echo of William Bennet's hollow justifications and Clarissa's venomous poise still rang through the gilded halls. "You don't understand, Isabel. This marriage will secure everything. The company, our name, your future," William had said, hands clasped tightly as if prayer might absolve him. "My future?" Isabel's voice had cracked, disbelieving. "Or yours?" Clarissa's smile had been cutting. "You should feel honored. Damien Lacroix is a man any woman would be foolish to refuse. A Lacroix does not ask twice." Isabel had wanted to laugh or scream, preferably both. Instead, she had stood frozen in that heavy, suffocating silence, realizing the ugly truth she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. She was no longer a daughter in this house. She was an asset leveraged against the ruins of a crumbling empire. Bennet Enterprises, once a shining star in Parisian commerce, had been quietly bleeding for years. Mismanaged funds, reckless investments, and the slow erosion of public trust had hollowed it from within. William had ignored every warning, clinging to the glory of a name that meant little in the modern world. Clarissa, ever the opportunist, had married into the Bennets when the decline had just begun, no doubt already calculating her exit strategy. And Isabel? Isabel had been too busy surviving to notice how quickly the walls had closed in. The plan was painfully simple. Marry Damien Lacroix, the untouchable, ruthless CEO of Lacroix Industries, and in return receive a strategic investment large enough to stabilize Bennet Enterprises. Her happiness, her autonomy, her dreams, none of it factored into the equation. The rain thickened, blurring the sharp lines of the city into an impressionist painting of gold and grey. Isabel closed her eyes and let the sound of it drown her. In another life, another time she would have run, packed her bags, disappeared into the maze of Paris, rebuilt herself brick by stubborn brick. But this wasn't just about her anymore. Hundreds of employees relied on the company her father was prepared to gamble away. Their lives hung in the balance, and Isabel knew, no matter how much she hated it, she couldn't walk away. She pressed her forehead harder against the window, willing herself not to cry. Crying was useless. Crying wouldn't save anyone. Soft knock on the door made her stiffen. She didn't need to ask who it was. Clarissa's perfume, something cloying and sharp, preceded her into the room. "My dear," Clarissa cooed, stepping gracefully over the threshold, "I hope you're not sulking." Isabel said nothing, staring at the world beyond the window as if she could will herself into it. "You're thinking emotionally again. It's unbecoming," Clarissa continued, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. She perched on the edge of the chaise lounge, inspecting her manicured nails. "This marriage is an opportunity. Damien Lacroix is not a man to be trifled with. Secure him, and you secure everything." Isabel turned her head slowly, her gaze cold and unwavering. "I was under the impression you had already sold me to him." Clarissa's smile sharpened. "Don't be melodramatic. You'll thank me one day." A brittle silence stretched between them. Finally, Isabel spoke, her voice low and dangerous. "If you think I will ever be grateful to you for this, you are more delusional than I thought." Clarissa's eyes glittered, but she said nothing. She rose, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. "You'll find that gratitude is not a requirement for survival, Isabel, only obedience." And then she was gone, leaving a faint trail of perfume and poison in her wake. Isabel closed her eyes again, feeling the last fragile pieces of her childhood shatter and fall away. Later that night, as the storm raged against the Parisian skyline, Isabel sat alone at her desk and stared at the blank page before her. It was supposed to be a letter. A goodbye, perhaps, to the life she had dreamed of but would never live. Instead, she wrote 3 simple lines. I will not be broken. I will not be silent. And I will never belong to Damien Lacroix. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were fractured and restless, filled with images of cages and glass towers crumbling to dust. Across the city, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, Damien Lacroix stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, staring out into the storm. The world. He was untouchable. A man of precision and calculation, who saw people as assets and deals as games of power. But even Damien Lacroix knew the gravity of what he was about to do. He had read Isabelle's file with cold detachment. Her education, her work history, her reputation for being sharp-tongued and stubborn. She was a minor player in the world he dominated, but a necessary one, a means to an end. And yet, there had been something in her photograph. Something he couldn't name. A glint of defiance that felt like a direct challenge. Damien wasn't a man easily challenged, and he didn't like the way that single image, that single woman, had managed to unsettle him. He turned away from the window, his reflection a ghost against the rain-streaked glass. Tomorrow he would meet her. Tomorrow he would set the final pieces into motion. It would be a simple transaction, he reminded himself. Strategic, necessary. There would be no room for complications, no room for regret, and certainly no room for whatever dangerous thing had begun to stir inside him when he thought of Isabel Bennet. Outside, the storm continued to rage, indifferent to the battles already brewing in the hearts of those who believed they had mastered fate. But some storms could not be controlled, and some fates, no matter how carefully written, could never be avoided. The corridors of the Ritz. Paris gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, the marble floors reflecting the grandeur of centuries past. Yet for Isabel Bennet, the hotel's beauty felt almost grotesque tonight, a golden cage too opulent to find comfort within. She sat at a long mahogany table inside a private lounge reserved for the most exclusive of guests. In front of her, the thick marriage contract lay unopened, waiting like a beast ready to devour. Her hands rested calmly on the table, but beneath her composed exterior, her heart thundered. She had worn a dark green dress, not because she wanted to impress, but because the color reminded her of the deep forests outside Paris, of freedom, of everything disagreement threatened to take from her. The door opened with a subtle click. Isabel did not look up immediately. She heard the sound of polished shoes across the marble, the deliberate cadence of a man who never had to rush for anyone. Only when the footsteps paused in front of her did she lift her gaze. Damien Lacroix stood before her, the man who had become the centerpiece of her nightmares and now her future. He was taller than she expected, his presence filling the room, even though he said nothing. Dressed in a black suit with no tie, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to hint at rebellion against his otherwise pristine appearance, Damien embodied power so effortlessly it felt almost like a second skin. His eyes were sharp, cold, the color of a winter sky before the snow. Not beautiful, dangerous. For a brief moment their eyes locked, and in that fleeting instant something passed between them. Not warmth, not recognition, but something almost more dangerous. An unspoken promise that neither of them would go down without a fight. Damien broke the silence first. His voice was low, measured, impossibly steady. "Miss Bennet?" Isabel gave a slight nod. "Mr. Lacroix." He motioned toward the chair across from her and sat without waiting for permission. There was no need for pleasantries. They both understood what tonight was about. Between them, the contract waited. "You've read the terms?" he asked. Isabel glanced down at the thick stack of papers and let out a quiet breath. "I read enough." "Good," Damien said, his tone brisk. "Then you understand this is not a marriage in any traditional sense. This is a transaction, an alliance." Isabel tilted, her head slightly studying him. "And what exactly does the alliance entail? Annual board meetings? Holiday cards?" There was a flicker, almost imperceptible, of something like amusement in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It entails exactly what the document outlines. 1 year of marriage, public appearances when necessary. No interference in each other's private lives, no expectations of intimacy or affection." The words were clinical, scrubbed clean of anything human. "And after a year?" Isabel asked, voice deceptively casual. "After a year," Damien said, "we part. Ways, you will have served your purpose. I will have served mine." Isabel felt a sharp pang in her chest, not because she had expected tenderness, but because she realized how very alone she would be inside this gilded prison. "Do you have any objections?" Damien asked, his tone betraying nothing. Isabel considered him for a long moment. She thought of the people whose livelihoods depended on the survival of Bennett Enterprises. She thought of her father's hollowed-out face. She thought of the life she might have had, and the one she was about to lose. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that was more weapon than warmth. "Just one," she said. Damien raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" "If you think you can control me with a piece of paper, Mr. Lacroix, you're mistaken." There it was again, that fleeting flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. It was gone before she could be sure. Without another word, she picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the contract. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. Damien leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers as he took the document and slid it back into the folder. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Lacroix," he said. The way he said it made her skin prickle. It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. The wedding was arranged within days. It had to be quick, clean, efficient. Another box to tick on Damien Lacroix's endless checklist of achievements. The ceremony was held at the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte, just outside Paris, a place so grand it seemed carved from a fairy tale. But for Isabel, it might as well have been a mausoleum. The guest list was selective and cold. Business magnates, politicians, socialites who understood alliances more than they understood love. The press were kept at a distance, but not out of sight. Appearances had to be maintained. Isabel stood before the towering doors of the chateau, clad in a gown of ivory silk that clung to her slender frame like a second skin. Her hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, leaving her neck bare and vulnerable. She felt no butterflies, no joy, only a strange, aching detachment. William Bennett stood beside her, stiff in his tuxedo, refusing to meet her eyes. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen. She had done her part and retreated, confident the machinery she had set into motion would not falter now. The music swelled and the doors opened. Isabel stepped forward. Damien waited at the altar, flanked by men who looked like they had been carved from the same cold stone. He wore a black suit tailored to brutal perfection, and his eyes, those merciless eyes, never left her. The ceremony was swift. When asked if he took Isabel as his lawfully wedded wife, Damien said, "I do," without hesitation. His voice, a clean blade slicing through the silence. When it was Isabel's turn, she paused just for a fraction of a second and saw the tension ripple across the faces of the guests. Then she smiled, not the demure smile expected of a bride, but a fierce, unyielding one, and said clearly, "I do." The kiss was perfunctory. Their lips brushed briefly, cold and practiced, a silent agreement that this was nothing more than performance. Afterward, at the reception, Isabel stood beside Damien, accepting congratulations from strangers whose eyes gleamed with curiosity and calculation. She smiled when required, laughed when prompted, and played her role to perfection. Damien remained at her side, impassive, a figure of black and ice. He offered her his arm when needed, whispered brief instructions in her ear, but never once spoke to her beyond necessity. And yet, despite the distance he maintained, Isabel could feel him, an electric current pulsing in the space between them, tense and volatile. Later that evening, as they drove back to Paris in a limousine that smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, Isabel stared out the window at the city she no longer recognized. Damien sat beside her, silent. Finally, she spoke. "Do you always treat your acquisitions this coldly?" she asked, her tone light but edged with steel. He didn't look at her. "Acquisitions don't usually speak back." She smiled bitterly. "Then I suppose you'll find me an unusual investment." "Dai, sir?" Corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. A crack in the armor. "Unusual," he murmured. "Yes, I imagine you will be." The city lights washed over them in gold and silver waves, illuminating two strangers bound together by ink and desperation. Neither of them spoke again until the limousine slid to a stop in front of Damien's penthouse. As Isabel stepped out, into the cool night air, she felt the weight of the city settle onto her shoulders. A mantle of expectation and betrayal she would wear for the foreseeable future, and somewhere deep inside, under the fear and anger and loss, a seed of defiance took root. She would play the role they demanded. She would walk into Damien Lacroix's cold empire. But she would not disappear. Not now, not ever. The penthouse loomed before her like a monument to cold ambition, all steel and glass polished to a brutal gleam. Isabel stepped through the threshold, her new husband a silent shadow behind her. The door closed with a heavy finality, shutting out the sounds of Paris and sealing her inside a world designed to be impenetrable. She let her eyes roam across the cavernous space. Expansive windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering an endless view of the city's glittering skyline. Everything inside was sleek, minimalist, unwelcoming. Black leather, chrome, monochrome paintings that hinted at emotion but offered none. It was a fortress of isolation, and somehow it suited Damien Lacroix perfectly. Isabel walked forward, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors, the sound swallowed quickly by the vast emptiness. There were no photographs, no personal touches, not a single trace of the man who supposedly lived here. Just curated sterility, as if any sign of vulnerability had been carefully scrubbed away. She turned, arms crossed loosely over her chest, and found Damien standing a few feet away, watching her with that inscrutable gaze. "So," she said, her voice light but laced with something sharper, "this is the beginning of our fairy tale." Damien said nothing. He shrugged out of his jacket with efficient movements and tossed it onto a nearby chair. The muscles in his forearms flexed under the rolled-up sleeves of his shirt, and Isabel hated herself a little for noticing. "This is your home now," he said, his voice as smooth and detached as the decor around them. "You are free to do as you wish, within reason." "How generous," she murmured. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There are 2 bedrooms," he continued. "Yours is down the hall to the right. My wing is off limits." "Of course," Isabel said, tilting her head. "Wouldn't want to contaminate the sacred halls." A flicker of amusement passed through Damien's eyes. Or perhaps it was irritation. It was impossible to tell. Without another word, he turned and disappeared down one of the corridors, leaving her alone in the vast silence. Isabel exhaled slowly. She wandered further into the penthouse, trailing her fingers along the smooth surfaces. Everything here was designed to minimize contact, to erase any trace of life. She wondered if Damien had chosen it himself, or if he had simply instructed a designer to create a space as unfeeling as its owner. In her new bedroom, she found a king-sized bed with perfectly ironed sheets, a walk-in closet already stocked with elegant, conservative clothing, none of it chosen by her, and a vanity that looked like it had never been touched. It was beautiful. It was suffocating. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closed door across the hall, the one that led to Damien's wing. How easy it would be to accept this arrangement, to retreat into herself, to become another silent ornament in his life, like the sterile paintings lining the walls. But Isabel Bennet had never been good at obedience. Later that evening, she found herself in the penthouse kitchen, poking through the cabinets. She wasn't hungry. She was restless. The silence pressed down on her, thick and heavy. She found a bottle of red wine and a single glass. No need for 2, apparently. Pouring herself a generous amount, she wandered barefoot across the cold marble floors, her dress from the ceremony still clinging to her like a memory she couldn't shake. She ended up on the rooftop terrace, where the city unfolded below like a living, breathing thing. The Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance, golden and eternal. She leaned against the balcony rail, the wind tugging at her hair, and sipped the wine slowly. It tasted expensive and hollow. "You're not following the script," a voice said from behind her. She didn't jump. She turned slowly to find Damien standing there, arms crossed over his chest, his shirt sleeves pushed up, his expression unreadable. "Script?" she echoed. "You're supposed to be unpacking, or hiding, or crying," he said. "Not drinking my wine and admiring the view." Isabel smiled over the rim of her glass. "Maybe your other acquisitions were more obedient." Damien's eyes darkened. "You are not an acquisition." "Am I not?" They stood there, the air between them charged with something volatile. Isabel set her glass down on the balcony ledge and stepped closer. "Tell me something, Damien," she said softly. "Was there ever a moment, even a second, when you thought of me as a person and not just a solution?" For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then he stepped forward, so close she could feel the heat of him even through the night chill. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dangerous. "You think too much," he said. "And you don't think at all," she shot back, her voice trembling with something that wasn't fear. He reached out then as if to touch her, but stopped himself at the last second, his hand hovering in the air between them. The moment stretched, taut and trembling. Finally, he let his hand drop. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the penthouse, the door swinging shut behind him with a final hollow click. Isabel stood there, heart hammering in her chest, staring at the space where he had been. She realized something, then something that both terrified and exhilarated her. Damien Lacroix might control the world outside, but inside, here with her, he was losing control. The days that followed blurred into a strange, silent rhythm. They lived together as strangers, passing each other in the halls like shadows. Damien spent most of his time locked away in his private office, emerging only for brief transactional conversations. Isabel roamed the penthouse freely, deliberately leaving small traces of herself everywhere. A book left open on the coffee table, a throw blanket tossed across the sterile black couch, a record player she unearthed from a forgotten closet and filled with the sound of jazz. She was determined to unsettle him. And it worked. She caught him watching her sometimes. In the kitchen, when she danced barefoot while making coffee. In the living room, when she curled up with a novel on the floor instead of the perfect designer chairs. His gaze was sharp, almost accusatory, as if she were rewriting the very rules of his existence just by breathing differently. One night, restless and aching, she wandered into the main living room and found a dusty chess set tucked away on a shelf. She set it up in the center of the glass coffee table, placing the pieces with meticulous care. The next morning, when she returned, she found one of the pawns moved, a silent challenge. She smiled to herself and made her counter move. Thus began their unspoken war. Each morning, a new move. Each evening, a new counter move. No words were exchanged about it. No agreements, no acknowledgements. But the game was there, alive between them, a thread of connection neither of them could deny. It was on the fifth night that everything shifted. Isabel had just played an aggressive move, sacrificing a bishop to corner Damien's queen when he appeared, freshly showered, a towel slung casually around his neck, his hair damp and tousled. He said nothing as he approached. He sat across from her, studying the board, his brow furrowed in concentration. Without looking up, he spoke. "You're reckless." Isabel sipped her tea, hiding her smile. "Maybe, or maybe I just know the value of sacrifice." His gaze snapped to hers, then sharp and assessing. "You think you know everything?" he said. "I think," she said calmly, "that you're afraid of losing." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Damien leaned back, his mouth curving into something that almost resembled a smile. But it was a dangerous smile, one that promised storms. "I never lose," he said. "Neither do I," she replied. They stared at each other across the battlefield of black and white squares, two warriors locked in a war neither fully understood, and for the first time since she had signed her name to that cursed contract, Isabel felt something stir inside her, something wild and exhilarating, not hatred, not resentment, but the thrill of possibility, the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage of cold necessity could become something far more dangerous, because if Damien Lacroix thought he could cage her spirit, he had underestimated her, and if Isabel Bennet thought she could survive him unscathed, she had underestimated herself. The pieces were set. The game had begun, and neither of them would emerge unchanged. The city of Paris glittered far below the penthouse windows, a living, breathing organism of light and movement. From the terrace, Isabel Bennet could almost pretend that she was still free. Still the woman who had once walked these streets with purpose instead of feeling trapped inside a life crafted by ambition and necessity. She leaned over the balcony rail, the cool wind tugging strands of hair loose from her bun. In her hands she held a small sunflower she had picked up from a street vendor earlier that day, a stubborn, bright thing defiantly blooming against the grey of early spring. It was a foolish gesture, one she knew Damien would scoff at, but she needed it. A piece of herself in a place that still felt like someone else's mausoleum. Behind her, the sliding glass door opened with a whisper. Isabel didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew his presence now, the way the air shifted when Damien Lacroix entered a room, carrying with him a gravity she could feel along her skin. "You're not supposed to be out here," he said, his voice low. "I needed fresh air," Isabel replied, not looking at him. A long silence stretched between them. She could feel him watching her, could feel the battle inside him, the part of him that wanted to order her back inside, and the part that knew she would not obey. She turned at last, meeting his gaze. "You live in the clouds, Damien, but even you can't escape needing to breathe." Something flickered across his face, There and gone in an instant, too fast for her to name. He stepped closer, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. His eyes dropped to the flower in her hand. "What is that?" "A reminder," Isabel said simply. "For what?" She smiled, soft and sharp at once. "That even in a place built of stone, something wild can still grow." Damien's gaze held hers for a long moment, and she saw something shift deep within him, something fragile, something furious. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, but Isabel did not feel defeated. She felt alive. She was breaking through. The next few days unfolded like a dance neither of them had agreed to, but both could not resist. Isabel continued her campaign of small rebellions, leaving evidence of life scattered throughout Damien's sterile world. She filled the silent penthouse with music, old jazz records she found in dusty boxes. She rearranged the stiff furniture into cozy clusters that invited conversation. She painted tiny, defiant watercolors and left them in unexpected places, tucked onto bookshelves pinned to the refrigerator. At first, Damien said nothing. He walked through the changes as if blind to them, his face a mask of indifference. But Isabel caught the moments when he hesitated, when his hand hovered a fraction longer over a record player, when his eyes lingered on a splash of color she had painted onto a blank wall. One evening, she found herself in the kitchen, barefoot and humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. It had started as an act of rebellion. She refused to live on the perfectly portioned, tasteless meals Damien's private chef delivered every day. But cooking had quickly become a small act of reclaiming the space for herself. Damien appeared in the doorway watching her. She didn't look up, but she felt the weight of his stare. "You cook," he said almost to himself. She smiled without turning. "Don't look so shocked. Not all battles are fought with contracts and mergers." He stepped further into the room, the air shifting again, heavier now. "You think this is a battle?" Isabel set down her knife and turned to face him. "Isn't it?" Their eyes locked across the counter, the tension between them sharp and electric. Isabel wondered if he realized that every word, every glance, every moment spent in each other's orbit was another move in a game neither of them could afford to lose. But what if winning wasn't the point anymore? Later that night she found herself back on the rooftop, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the stars bright above the city. She didn't hear Damien approach, but she sensed him sit down beside her, careful not to touch. They sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that grew not from discomfort, but from a fragile, emerging trust. Finally, he spoke. "I don't remember the last time I looked at the stars." Isabel turned her head to study him. In the dim light, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man haunted by things he had never spoken aloud. "Why not?" she asked gently. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Because they reminded me of things I couldn't control," he said at last. She let the words settle between them, heavy and aching. "I think," she said after a moment, "that the things we can't control are the most beautiful." Damien turned his head then, looking at her in a way that made her breath catch. There was something raw in his eyes, something unguarded. It terrified her. It thrilled her. Days slipped into nights, and slowly, imperceptibly, the walls between them began to crack. Damien found excuses to be in the same room as her, lingering in the kitchen while she cooked, appearing on the terrace when she sat sketching. He asked questions now, small ones, about the books she read, the music she played, the paintings she left tucked into forgotten corners. He never touched her, not even by accident. But sometimes Isabel thought she could feel the ghost of a touch in the air between them, a yearning so powerful it left her dizzy. The city bloomed into early spring, and with it something new took root between them. Something delicate, dangerous, and real. But storms were brewing too. Isabel could feel it in the way Clarissa's name came up more often in Damien's curt business calls, in the guarded glances he thought she didn't notice. And she remembered her vow, never to let herself forget what this marriage had started as. A transaction, a chess move, a weapon. Even if Damien Lacroix was no longer just the enemy, he was still dangerous. One night, after a long day spent volunteering at a local orphanage, a piece of her old life she refused to give up, Isabel returned to the penthouse to find Damien waiting for her in the living room. He was seated on the couch, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but something in the air told her this was no ordinary conversation. "I heard you were at the orphanage today," he said without preamble. Isabel set down her bag carefully, keeping her voice light. "News travels fast. He didn't smile. You should be careful. She crossed her arms. Are you worried about the paparazzi? Or about me embarrassing you? His jaw tightened. I'm worried about you being used. For a moment she just stared at him, stunned. Then she laughed. A soft, incredulous sound. You think I'm so fragile? No, he said. I think you're stubborn enough to get hurt. She stepped closer, emboldened by the rawness she heard in his voice. Maybe that's not your decision to make, she said quietly. He looked up at her then, and for the first time since they had met, Isabel saw real fear in Damien Lacroix's eyes. Not fear of scandal, not fear of failure, fear of losing something or someone he hadn't realized he needed until it was almost too late. She softened just slightly. You can't protect me from the world, Damien, she said, and you shouldn't try. He set down his glass and rose to his full height, towering over her, but there was no threat in his posture, only a terrible, aching vulnerability he could not seem to hide. Maybe I don't know how to stop trying, he admitted. The words hung between them, fragile and powerful. Isabel reached out, not to touch him, but to close the space between them in a way that felt just as intimate. You don't have to protect me, she said. You just have to let me in. They stood there, two broken souls on the cusp of something neither had expected to find in this cold arrangement. Something wild, something unstoppable. Something that would either destroy them both or set them free. And as the night deepened around them, Isabel knew with a certainty she could feel in her bones. The battle they were fighting was no longer against each other. It was against the walls they had built to survive, and it was a battle they might just be ready to lose. Isabel sat down, slowly on the couch opposite Damien, curling her legs beneath her, her dress cascading around her like a pool of midnight. She studied him, really studied him. The sharp lines of his face, the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested tensely on his knees. He looked like a man trapped in his own skin, as if every instinct told him to run, but something stronger, something deeper, kept him tethered there with her. It was strange, sitting across from someone you barely knew, and yet feeling like you held pieces of their soul they didn't even realize they had given away. You know, Isabel said softly, breaking the silence, when I was a little girl, I thought marriage would be the beginning of everything beautiful. I thought it would be love, adventure, home. Damien's lips pressed into a thin line. And now? She smiled sadly. Now it feels more like a negotiation. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and she knew her words had hit their mark. Damien leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze pinned to hers. You deserved better. The admission was raw, unexpected. It made something ache, deep inside her. I deserve many things, Isabel said, her voice almost a whisper. But we don't always get what we deserve, do we? Damien looked away then, staring into the fireplace as if it might offer him answers he could not find in her eyes. No, we don't. They sat there for a long while, the only sound the distant hum of the city below, the occasional crackle from the fire. Finally, Isabel rose to her feet and crossed to the large bay window that overlooked Paris. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the cars wind like tiny veins through the sleeping city. I don't want to live like this, Damien, she said without turning. I don't want to be a ghost in my own life. Behind her, she heard him shift, rising from his seat. His reflection appeared beside hers in the glass, tall, broad, and heartbreakingly alone. What do you want? He asked. And there was no mockery in the question, only a quiet, desperate need to understand. Isabel turned to face him fully, her eyes shining not with tears, but with fierce, unbreakable conviction. I want a life that's mine, she said, not one arranged for convenience, not one traded for a company's survival. I want laughter. I want messy mornings and unexpected kisses. I want to argue about silly things and dance in the kitchen when no one's watching. She took a step closer, her voice growing stronger. I want to be more than a pawn on someone else's chessboard. Damien stood there, breathing shallowly, as if every word she spoke was chiseling cracks into the armor he had spent years perfecting. And you? She asked, softer now. What do you want, Damien? He didn't answer immediately. He moved closer still until there was barely a breath of space between them. I don't know, he said, his voice low, raw. I don't remember how to want anything that isn't safe. Isabel reached up then, not touching him, but letting her hand hover just above his heart. Maybe it's time you remembered. Their eyes held, something unspoken passing between them. a fragile, terrifying promise that neither dared voice aloud. The air between them was charged, heavy with possibilities. Damien closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength against an invisible tide, then stepped back, breaking the moment. "I need to think," he said, his voice rough. "Take all the time you need," Isabel said, her own heart pounding. But in the deepest part of herself she knew. Some decisions couldn't wait forever. When Damien disappeared into his private wing, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, Isabel remained by the window, watching the stars blink faintly against the velvet sky. She wasn't sure when she had started wanting more from him than just freedom. She wasn't sure when he had become more than just the enemy. Maybe it didn't matter. Because what she knew, what she felt, was that whatever storm was coming, she would face it head on. Not as a pawn, not as a prisoner, but as herself. And if Damien Lacroix chose to meet her halfway, to tear down the walls he had hidden behind for so long, then maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ruins. Something real, something worth fighting for. And if he didn't, she would survive that too, because Isabel Bennett had spent her entire life learning how to survive storms. Now, she was ready to become one. The rain returned to Paris as if it had been waiting for this moment, pouring down in relentless sheets that blurred the city into a watercolor of broken lights. Isabel stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, her fingers tracing invisible patterns against the cool glass, heart heavy with a weight she couldn't name. Somewhere behind her, Damien moved through the shadows, his presence a constant pull. But tonight, she needed distance even more than she needed comfort. She had received the news only hours ago, though she had long suspected something was coming. Clarissa had always been too quiet lately, too content. And now Isabel knew why. Clarissa had moved against her, not openly, not with fire or fury, but with contracts, with stolen dreams and signatures penned in betrayal. The non-profit foundation Isabel had fought to create, the project she had poured her soul into, was no longer hers. It had been bought out, the board manipulated, her vision twisted into something hollow and corporate. She should have seen it coming. The sound of Damien's voice cut through her thoughts, low and rough. "Talk to me." She turned, the anger and heartbreak flashing in her eyes. "Why? So you can justify it?" Damien stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I don't know what you're talking about." Isabel stepped closer, the fury building inside her finding its voice at last. "You made a deal with her, didn't you? Clarissa, you're part of this." His face closed off, the shutters coming down so fast she could almost hear them slam. "It's not what you think." She let out a bitter laugh. "Isn't it? You stand there silent while she guts the only thing that ever mattered to me, and you expect me to believe you're innocent?" Damien said nothing, and in that silence, Isabel felt the fragile thread between them snap. She shook her head, blinking back the sting of tears. "I should have known. I was a fool to think you were different." Damien stepped forward, his voice cracking through the air like thunder. "I didn't betray you." "Then why does it feel like you did?" she whispered. The rain battered the windows, a fierce, relentless rhythm against the silence that stretched between them. Isabel turned away, gathering her bag with trembling hands. "Where are you going?" Damien asked, his voice low. "Away from here," she said. "Away from you." She didn't look back as she left, didn't see the way Damien's shoulders sagged, didn't hear the way he cursed under his breath, as if trying to tear the grief from his own chest. She only knew the hollow sound of the door closing behind her. The streets of Paris were slick and glistening under the rain. Isabel walked without direction, the cold soaking through her clothes, her skin, her bones. She welcomed it. The numbness was easier to bear than the pain. She found herself in Montmartre, the artist's quarter, where once she had dreamed of opening her own small studio, a place filled with laughter and color and music. Now it seemed like a fantasy from another life. She ducked into a tiny cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly. The warmth and smell of coffee wrapped around her, but it didn't touch the chill inside her. She ordered a cup of coffee she barely tasted and sat by the window, staring out at the rain. The hours slipped by in a blur. She was vaguely aware of people coming and going, the soft murmur of conversation, the clink of cups and silverware. But her mind stayed fixed on Damien, on the betrayal, the broken promises, the unbearable possibility that somewhere along the way she had started to hope for something real. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made fools of the strong and prisoners, of the brave. When the cafe owner finally tapped her gently on the shoulder to tell her they were closing, Isabel realized it was nearly midnight. She stepped back into the night, the rain now reduced to a mist that clung to her hair and eyelashes. She didn't want to go back to the penthouse. She wasn't sure she could bear the sight of him, but she had nowhere else to go. As she wandered through the winding streets, she heard the echo of footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Only shadows and the shifting mist. She shook herself, cursing her imagination, and kept walking. Across the city, Damien sat alone in the darkened penthouse, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He stared out at the city he had conquered, and felt nothing but defeat. He had built empires, crushed rivals, survived betrayals that would have broken lesser men. But none of it had prepared him for the devastation of losing her. He thought he could control this, like everything else in his life. Keep her at a distance, protect her without letting her in. But Isabel was not something to be protected or controlled. She was a force unto herself, wild, brilliant, and unbearably real. And he had broken her. He cursed under his breath and rose to his feet, pacing, like a caged animal. He needed to fix this, needed to find her. But the weight of his own mistakes held him down. He had been silent when he should have spoken, distant when he should have reached for her, and now he feared it was too late. Isabel found herself standing on a small bridge overlooking the Seine, the river flowing silently beneath her. She gripped the cold iron railing, the mist weaving through her hair like a crown. She thought of her mother, of the promises she had made to herself long ago, to be brave, to fight for her own happiness no matter the cost. She had survived betrayal before. She would survive this. But the thought of living without the sliver of hope Damien had awakened in her made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She closed her eyes, letting the rain wash away the tears she refused to shed, and then, through the mist and the cold, she heard it, her name. She turned slowly, her heart stumbling in her chest. Damien stood at the other end of the bridge, his hair damp from the rain, his coat hanging open, his face unguarded for the first time since she had met him. He didn't speak again. He only stood there, as if afraid that if he moved too quickly, she would disappear. Isabel stared at him, torn between the impulse to run and the aching need to stay. Slowly, Damien took a step forward, then another, until he stood before her, close enough that she could see the raindrops clinging to his lashes, the raw vulnerability etched into every line of his face. "I didn't make a deal with her," he said, his voice low and rough. "I didn't sell you out." Isabel shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "But you didn't stop her either." "I was trying to protect you," he said, the words torn from him. "I thought if I stayed silent, if I handled it behind the scenes, I could shield you from it," she laughed, a broken sound. "You don't protect someone by betraying their trust." "I know," he said, and there was such agony in his voice that it made her chest tighten painfully. "I know I failed you. I know I don't deserve another chance. But I'm asking for one anyway." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the original plans for her foundation, the ones Clarissa had tried to destroy. "I fought for this," he said, thrusting it into her hands. "It's yours. Always was. Always will be." Isabel unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, the ink smudged slightly from the rain but still legible. She looked up at him, searching his face for deception and finding none. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. Damien shook his head, a broken smile curving his lips. "Nothing," he said. "Everything. Only what you're willing to give." The rain fell harder now, a silver curtain between them and the rest of the world. Isabel took a step closer, the paper pressed against her chest. "You hurt me," she said. "I know. I don't trust you. I'll earn it," he vowed. She searched his eyes one last time and saw the truth there. Not perfection, not promises of easy happiness, but the messy, terrifying possibility of something real. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing his. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and sometimes beginnings were enough. The days after the confrontation on the bridge passed in a blur, suspended between silence and fragile hope. Isabel returned to the penthouse reluctantly, her heart heavy with caution. She wasn't ready to forgive Damien, and he didn't expect her to. He gave her space without retreating completely, a silent sentinel at the edges of her life, never pushing but always present. Trust, once broken, was not easily mended. Isabel carried the weight of that knowledge with her into every room, every conversation, every look exchanged between them. Yet beneath the lingering hurt, something stubborn still flickered. A belief that perhaps despite everything, something real could still grow from the wreckage. Damien, for his part, seemed determined to prove himself not with words, but with actions. True to his vow, he moved quickly and decisively, launching a plan that left no room for doubt. It started quietly, without grand declarations or staged confrontations. Through a network of discreet investigators and legal experts, Damien had the inheritance contracts Clarissa held re-examined. He uncovered the web of deception, the forged signatures, the backdoor deals designed to strip Isabel of her birthright. Isabel found out not because Damien boasted about it, but because one afternoon, while she sat sketching at the kitchen table, a thick folder appeared beside her coffee cup. Inside were pages of evidence, each more damning than the last. She looked up to find Damien watching her from across the room, arms folded, face unreadable. "What is this?" she asked, her voice guarded. "Proof," he said simply. "Proof that your stepmother built her empire on lies. Proof that you have every right to take it back." Isabel turned the pages slowly, her heart thudding with every revelation. Financial statements, recorded conversations, hidden transactions. It was all there, laid bare. She lifted her eyes to his. "You did this." He didn't nod, didn't smile. He only said, "It's your turn to fight." Her fingers tightened around the folder. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much she had needed this. Not vengeance, not even justice, but the chance to reclaim her own story. The next few weeks became a storm of preparation. Meetings with lawyers, private consultations with shareholders, long, tense nights spent crafting a strategy that would not just expose Clarissa, but dismantle her hold on Bennett Enterprises entirely. Damien stayed by Isabel's side through it all, offering advice when asked, silence when needed. He no longer tried to control or steer her. He trusted her to lead, and in doing so, he gave her the greatest gift he could, belief in her strength. Together they built a plan so thorough, so devastating, that by the time the day of the shareholders' meeting arrived, Clarissa never saw it coming. The conference room at Bennett Enterprises headquarters was filled with the heavy scent of polished wood and cold ambition. Clarissa sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed in a tailored suit, her smile a mask of calculated charm. She looked every inch the victorious widow, secure in her stolen kingdom. Isabel entered the room with Damien beside her, radiating a calm confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Heads turned. Murmured conversations fell silent. Clarissa's smile faltered for the first time. The meeting began as usual, with formal reports and forecasts. Clarissa spoke smoothly, weaving lies with the ease of long practice. But when it came time for Isabel to address the room, the atmosphere shifted. She stood, folder in hand, and spoke with a voice clear and unwavering. She presented the evidence meticulously, piece by damning piece. She exposed the forged documents, the embezzled funds, the manipulated board votes. Shareholders gasped. Directors whispered furiously among themselves. Faces that had once turned away from her now turned toward her, scandalized and enraged. Clarissa tried to interrupt, tried to spin the narrative. But the tide had already turned, and when Damien rose to support Isabel's claims with additional proof, a veritable arsenal of damning information, Clarissa's empire crumbled in a matter of minutes. The board voted swiftly. Effective. Immediately, Clarissa Bennett was removed as CEO and stripped of all her holdings. Bennett Enterprises, the legacy her father had built and she had fought so desperately to preserve, was returned to its rightful heir. Clarissa stood as the decision was announced, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Her gaze locked with Isabel's, and for a moment, the two women stared at each other across the battlefield of their shared past. Clarissa broke first, gathering her things with shaking hands and stalking from the room, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and failure. When the doors closed behind her, Isabel allowed herself a single trembling breath of relief. It was over. She had won. But as the room emptied, congratulations offered and promises of support murmured into the air, Isabel found herself turning toward Damien. He stood at the edge of the room, hands in his pockets, watching her not with pride or triumph, but with something deeper, something quieter. She crossed to him, heart in her throat. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook his head. "I didn't do this." "You gave me the weapons," she said. "I fought the battle. But you made sure I had the chance." For a long moment they said nothing. The weight of everything that had passed between them, everything still unsaid, hung in the air. Then Damien reached out, hesitating just long enough for her to pull away if she wished, before brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "You were never a pawn, Isabel," he said, his voice low. "You were always the queen." The words broke something inside her, not in pain, but in release. They left the building together, stepping into the golden afternoon light. Paris sprawled before them, the city alive with possibility. Later that night, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the air between them thick with everything they hadn't dared to say. Isabel leaned against the railing, staring out at the skyline. She felt Damien move beside her, close but not crowding, giving her space to breathe. "You don't owe me anything," he said at last. She turned to face him, heart pounding. "Maybe I want to give you something anyway." He inhaled, sharply, as if bracing himself for impact. She smiled, soft and genuine. "A future." His eyes darkened, something breaking loose inside him. "Isabel." She placed a hand over his heart, feeling it race beneath her palm. "I'm not offering you chains," she said. "I'm offering you freedom. The freedom to be more than what the world expects of you. The freedom to be loved." He closed his eyes, the weight of her words crashing over him. When he opened them again, there was no distance left between them. Only Damien, raw, unguarded, and Isabel, fierce and unafraid. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. She gasped softly as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. No contracts, no conditions. Only a question. "Marry me," he said, his voice shaking. "Not for alliances, not for appearances, for us, for whatever. Crazy, beautiful thing we can build together." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes, but she smiled through them. "I thought you'd never ask." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her all along. They stood there, bathed in the golden light of the city. Two broken souls who had found not perfection, but possibility. And sometimes that was even better. Together, they turned away from the city and toward each other. Toward something real. Toward a life chosen freely, fiercely, and forever. The night stretched long and luminous over Paris, and the city, for all its noise and wonder, seemed to hush around them, granting rare permission for quiet truths to unfold. Inside the penthouse, Isabel moved with a lightness she hadn't known in months. She ran her fingers along the piano tucked away in the far corner of the living room, an untouched relic that had come with the property. Its surface was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had dared summon music within these walls before. Without thinking, she lifted the cover and sat down. Her fingers, rusty but willing, found the keys, pressing down softly at first, then with growing confidence. A simple melody drifted through the air, clumsy, unpracticed, but sincere. It wasn't the kind of music Damien was used to. Not sharp, calculated perfection, but something raw, unfinished, alive. Drawn by the sound, Damien emerged from the balcony. He said nothing, but he leaned against the doorway, watching her. Isabel continued playing, aware of his presence but not afraid of it. Her fingers danced over the keys, weaving something intangible between them. A bridge, a hope, a truce. When the final notes faded, she looked up. Damien's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. "You play," he said quietly. "Barely," she replied with a small smile. "My mother taught me. She believed every home needed music to stay alive." He stepped closer, his movements slow, almost reverent. She was right. They stood there, the silence between them heavy, not with distance now, but with possibilities. "Damien," Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm afraid." He moved to kneel before her, his hands resting lightly on her knees. "Of me?" "No," she whispered. "Of wanting this too much. Of losing myself." He shook his head slowly, fiercely. "You are the only person I have ever known who could never be lost." The rawness of his words stole her breath. Still, fear lingered. "What if we ruin each other?" Damien's lips curved in the barest ghost of a smile. "Then we rebuild, as many times as it takes." Tears blurred Isabel's vision. She pressed her forehead against his, the closeness anchoring her. For a long time they stayed that way, neither speaking, both surrendering. And when they finally moved, it was not with desperation but with wonder. Damien rose and offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation. Together, they moved through the penthouse, past the sterile rooms now warmed by the smallest touches of rebellion she had scattered. A pillow out of place, a book left open, a single wildflower in a glass jar. They reached the bedroom, hers not his, and paused at the threshold. Damien lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, reverent. "You lead," he said simply. It was the greatest admission he could have made. Inside, the world fell away. No contracts, no betrayal, no fears. Only Damien's hands, tentative but sure, learning the shape of trust. Only Isabel's touch, undoing years of coldness and silence. They moved together in the dark, not with the frantic passion of desperate lovers, but with the slow, aching reverence of survivors who had finally found safe harbor in each other. Later, Isabel lay curled against him, tracing patterns across his chest with lazy fingers. "You're different," she said softly. "You made me different," he murmured. She lifted her head to look at him. "No, Damien. You chose to be different." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch unbearably gentle. "I chose you." Outside, the city breathed around them, vast and indifferent. But within these walls, a miracle was taking root. Messy, imperfect, and beautifully defiantly real. And for the first time since that fateful meeting at the Ritz, Isabel allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love was not a contract to be negotiated, but a life to be built. One breath, one choice, one impossible. Beautiful day at a time. They had lost so much. They had hurt each other. But they had also found something neither had dared hope for. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but the promise of tomorrow. Spring unfolded across France with slow, deliberate beauty, washing the countryside in vivid greens and soft golds. The Villa des Oliviers, perched at the edge of the rolling vineyards in Provence, came to life in a way that mirrored the transformation within its new owners. Flowers exploded along the stone walls, ivy crept in loving trails, and laughter, real unrestrained laughter, spilled from the once silent halls. Isabel Bennet stood barefoot in the garden, a simple sundress clinging to her frame, her hands covered in soil. She was replanting a row of wild roses, stubborn things that refused to stay neatly contained. And every stubborn root she coaxed into the ground felt like a victory. Inside the villa, Damien Lacroix watched her through the kitchen window, a faint, almost bewildered smile tugging at his lips. He had known power, ambition, even fleeting moments of admiration, but never anything like this. Never a woman who could dismantle his entire world with a single sun-drenched smile, only to rebuild it, stronger, kinder, freer. He brewed coffee, clumsily because Isabel had banned his assistants from setting foot in their home, and carried 2 mismatched mugs outside. The smell of earth and blooming lavender wrapped around him as he approached. "You're going to drown them," he said, nodding to the roses. Isabel wiped her hands on her dress and grinned up at him unbothered. "They're fighters, like me. They'll survive." He handed her a cup, brushing her fingers in the exchange. A quiet current passed between them, one they no longer ran from. Sitting side by side on the low stone wall, they sipped their coffee in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the vineyards. It was an ordinary moment, and because of that, it was extraordinary. "Are you happy?" Damien asked, at last, his voice rough with vulnerability. Isabel turned to him, the morning light gilding her hair. "I am," she said, "for the first time in a long time." He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding since the day they'd first met. She reached out, lacing her fingers through his. "And you?" she asked. He looked down at their joint, hands at the woman who had torn down every wall he had ever built and still chosen to stay. "I didn't know what happiness was until you." The simplicity of the confession struck her harder than any grand gesture. They stayed there until the sun grew too hot, until the bees buzzed lazily through the lavender, until their coffee cooled. And their hearts warmed. Planning the wedding was nothing like their first. No reporters, no shareholders, no glossy magazine spreads. Just them and the people who mattered. A celebration, not a negotiation. They chose a small chapel nestled in the hills, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and prayer. The ceremony would be held at noon under an arch of wildflowers that Isabel insisted on arranging herself. The night before the wedding, Damien found her in the garden again, weaving garlands by moonlight. "You should be resting," he said, dropping to sit beside her. She laughed softly. "I can't sleep. Too many butterflies." "Cold feet," he teased, though he asked it a little too carefully. Isabel leaned her head against his shoulder. "Never about you. Only about wanting everything to be perfect." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Perfect is overrated. I'll settle for real." She smiled against his chest. Then we'll have the most perfect imperfect wedding in history. On the morning of their wedding, the villa was a hive of quiet activity. Friends and family moved through the house, laughter and last-minute nerves tangling in the air. The scent of baking bread and wildflowers filled every room. Isabel stood before a mirror in her childhood bedroom, a simple sunlit space she had insisted on keeping untouched. Her gown was nothing like the opulent silk she had worn at her first wedding. It was soft and flowing, stitched with delicate embroidery that reminded her of the fields outside their window. She wore her hair down, loose curls tumbling over her shoulders. When she caught her reflection, she barely recognized the woman smiling back. Not because she had changed, but because she had found her way back to herself. Clarissa Bennet, now, little more than a fading spectre of a once-feared rival, had not been invited, nor had any of the polished parasites that had once clung to the Bennet name. This was not a stage for power plays or appearances. This was a sanctuary. When Isabel walked down the narrow aisle, her bare feet brushing the old stone floor, her heart thudded against her ribs, not with fear, but with an overwhelming bone-deep certainty. Damien stood waiting at the altar, wearing a dark grey suit that softened the sharpness of his features. His eyes never left hers, not even for a second. The officiant smiled warmly as he began, but the words faded into a hum in Isabel's ears. She only heard her own heartbeat and Damien's breathing, and the quiet, steady promise in the way he held out his hand. When it came time to speak their vows, they chose their own words. Damien cleared his throat, voice rough with emotion. I spent my life building walls, he said, believing strength meant standing alone. But you taught me that real strength is letting someone in. Isabel Bennet, you are my partner, my peace, my home. I choose you. Every day, every hour, every heartbeat. Isabel blinked back tears, smiling through the blur. She took his hand, grounding herself in his touch. Damien Lacroix, she said, her voice steady and sure. You were the storm I didn't see coming. You shattered the life I thought I wanted, and from the ruins, we built something better. I choose you, your strength, your flaws, your stubborn heart. I choose all of it. I choose us. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that erupted from the small crowd felt like a tidal wave of love. Damien leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that spoke of battles won, walls torn down, and the wild, beautiful unknown stretching before them. Afterward, under the golden sky of late afternoon, they danced barefoot in the gardens, laughter ringing out between the olive trees. There was no orchestra, no choreographed spectacle, just a single old record player spinning a love song scratchy with age, and two people who had finally learned to live in the imperfect, breathtaking moment. They didn't talk about the future that day, not about expansions or mergers or the endless march of ambition. They talked about planting sunflowers along the back fence, about rescuing another dog, about painting the guest room in ridiculous clashing colors because life was too short for beige. As the sun dipped low and the first stars blinked awake, Isabel rested her head on Damien's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in her life, she didn't wonder what would come next. Because whatever it was, joy, sorrow, triumph, failure, they would face it, together. And that was enough. It was everything. Just when it seemed life had settled into something whole and steady, the unexpected struck like a bolt from a clear sky. One crisp afternoon, as Damien and Isabel returned from a stroll through the vineyards, they found an unfamiliar black car parked outside the villa. A man in a dark suit leaned against the hood, arms crossed, a thin folder tucked beneath one arm. Damien's body tensed immediately. Isabel felt it through the brush of his hand against hers. The man stepped forward, his face a mask of practiced politeness. Mr. Lacroix, Miss Bennet, apologies for the intrusion. Damien's voice was ice. State your business. The man extended the folder. There's an investigation into Clarissa Bennet's dealings. New evidence has surfaced. It implicates others, including Bennet Enterprises, including you. Isabel's heart stuttered. What kind of evidence? The man's eyes flickered with something almost like sympathy. Financial misappropriation, fraud, allegations reaching back years. The words hit like stones. Isabel staggered a step back, the world tilting under her feet. Everything they had fought to reclaim, everything they had built, threatened to be dragged into a new, darker battle. Damien caught her hand, anchoring her, steady as ever. His jaw was set with the grim resolve she had come to know too well. "We'll fight," he said simply. "Together." And in his voice she found her strength again. No matter what storm was coming, they would weather it side by side. The story between Isabel and Damien is far from over, and the next chapters will be even more breathtaking. If you enjoyed their journey so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. Your support gives us the strength to create even more powerful stories for you. Stay tuned for what happens next.